Thanks for joining us today for our third webinar in this series. Today we will be joined by Rachael Tiffen, Cifas' Director for Local Government and Secretariat to the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally Board. Rachael will tell us about the recently launched Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally strategy. We'll follow this with a discussion about CIPFA's own Code of Practice on managing the risks of fraud and corruption. As ever, we will leave plenty of time at the end for questions, so keep these in mind. You can post them at any time in the chat function. Before I pass over to Rachael to tell you more, just wanted to cover a little bit of housekeeping. So please can I ask everyone to mute their microphones? I've muted you in any case, but just in case I've missed someone. There's a chat function at the bottom right of your screen. And you can write your questions in the chat box at the end, and questions or comments, and we'll take them towards the end. We'll be recording this session so that you can listen to it later on, and it'll be available afterwards on our website together with the slides. So I'll now pass you over to Rachael so you can learn more about the recently launched Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally strategy for the 2020s. Great, I hope you can see those now, Rachael. Lovely, over to you.
Yeah, I can see them. I can see them. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So if I just begin, I'll just tell you a little bit about me and what I'm doing here today. I'm Rachael Tiffen. I'm the Director of Local Government at Cifas, and I'm also Secretariat to the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally Board. Prior to being at Cifas, I worked at Grant Thornton, and prior to that I worked at Cifas, as some of you will know. And my background before that was some period in central government and a period in local government. And during my time at the Home Office, I was involved with the setting up of FFCL, and so I have been involved in it from the very, very beginning. So today I'm talking to you in my role as Secretariat to the FFCL board. I can see quite a few Cifas members have signed up, so today I'm not taking questions on Cifas. So if you want to talk to me about that, it'll have to be offline or another day. So first slide then, Laura, please. I think it's just introducing me. Great, okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background to the strategy, give you a bit of context about it and the timeline, and then talk about the research for 2020 and some of the things that have happened in the run-up to the strategy and what's happening at the moment. So, next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so here's our timeline. It's quite detailed. I'm not going to read every single thing out on it, but the purpose really of showing this to you is to show the longevity of the initiative and how much support there has been, even at points where we had difficulty going forward. So we started off the initiative in 2009, and myself and two other people actually have been on the board for the whole period of time that we've been going, although we've had several different boards. I'll talk a bit about how we started in a minute, but you can see here that when we kicked off in 2010, we had a number of pilots in place, and then in 2013 we had a new board, and we did the work for a second strategy which came out in 2016, and then in 2017 and 18 we had in place another new board, a widened board, and we did the strategy for the research for the strategy, which was published this March. So next slide, please. Okay, so the background to FFCL is that it began at the National Fraud Authority, where I was working in 2010, and a group of us were seconded into the NFA to look at public sector fraud, and one of the ideas was to put together a local government counter-fraud strategy. We were very fortunate in the time because we had some support from the Local Government Association and Solace, and was a report that was published called The Smarter Government, which recommended looking at local authority fraud in greater detail. So the NFA was able to put together a team and a temporary board to help lead the initiative. So the first things that we did was to go around and meet some of those senior stakeholders at the LGA and Solace, and at what was then called the Department of Communities and Local Government. The strategy really began about looking at just fraud, but as it expanded over the years, it's included corruption as well. Okay, so next slide, please. So here is what the strategy said in its first incarnation and also its second incarnation. Most of you will be familiar with the app pillars: acknowledge, prevent, and pursue. And the theory being that it works across as a sort of route, really, that if you acknowledge your fraud risks up front, you put in place proper fraud risk management and ensure that there is acknowledgement and support at the top of the organisation. You also work to prevent fraud and detect fraud as the next step, and that includes putting in place things like having an anti-fraud culture and making better use of information technology. And finally, you look at pursue, which is about prosecuting people and punishing fraud and recovering losses, and also doing civil sanctions. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we set off in 2010 and we published the first strategy, we agreed to have an annual report, a newsletter, 33 pilots we had going, which were all free, mostly data analytics. And in that first 6 months, with the use of private partners supporting those pilots, councils raised about 11 million. There were also free guides and tools. There was a housing fraud guide, regional partnerships advice, fraud risk, and a document called Powers and Penalties. The firms also supplied tools as well. We had a Powers guide. Grant Thornton supplied health checks. The very famous Mazars School Fraud Toolkit, and Deloitte supplied free e-learning. We also had awards and an annual conference and a showcase event. We had local authority chief executives from across the country who met and supported us and made the case for councils to step up resources. And when we published the document, a permanent board was set up. The NFA stopped chairing the board, and the new board was chaired by Ian O'Donnell, who was then the finance director at Ealing Council. After a while, it became very clear that we needed more support, and the only way that really we could do this was to invite the private sector onto the board. And so some of those people who had supplied support along the way, mainly external auditors, Grant Thornton and Mazars, joined the board and supported by way of sponsorship and providing venues and such. So next slide, please, Laura. So 2011, we had the first strategy out, and at the end of the year, we had our first review document. We also had other supporting documentation, council checklist, case studies. We had a section on protecting the public purse, the Audit Commission document. And if you remember when we launched FFCL first time round, there was a roadshow around the country, and we did fraud loss profiles for every council, which was a really good fun game. But people were able to take it away and make arguments for being able to set up teams. We had the Wheel of Fraud and other documents like Slipping Through the Net, which is a Cifas document joint with FFCL. Next slide, please, Laura. Right, so in 2015, we then began the work for the next document, and we had 11 workshops. I didn't actually attend any of those workshops myself. Fraud managers from the councils were part of the team that helped devise the document, and interested stakeholders. We had a temporary board in place, task and finish group, who cleared the document. However, we were beset by many hurdles, and we got the document cleared, and then there was an election. We went into PERDA, and there was a long delay for about 6 weeks. And when we came out the other end, we had to go through clearance again. And by the time we'd done all of that, because the ministers had changed, it was about a year after we intended to write that, we intended to publish that document. And so we bore that in mind when we were thinking about FFCL 2020, because during the period of time that we had drafted the document, many things had changed, and the counter-fraud landscape had changed. There were different organisations working in the area, and some of the fraud risks had changed. You'll see that in the 2016 document, although we have the Mazars Free Schools Fraud Toolkit, there is no mention of schools fraud in that document. And so there were many things that had kind of changed by the time we'd actually published. And so these were some of the lessons that we learned for next time round. So next slide, please, Laura. So the 2016 strategy, the research showed that really the same principles, those pillars of acknowledge, prevent and pursue, were still applicable, but the research came up with some themes which sort of sat underneath them, which were current issues, good and bad, within councils. So the 6 C's: culture, capability, capacity, competence, communication and collaboration. I would say actually that in 2020 the collaboration one has really stood out more than any of the others. So there's no point in me reading this slide out, you can all see it. If I move on to the next slide. Okay, so 2020. Bearing in mind all of the things that had happened before, the board had a few special meetings to talk about how we might do the research, do it better, and also treat it as an engagement campaign as much as getting the research. And so we agreed to do face-to-face workshops so far as possible. Cifas, now the secretariat to the board, offered my time pro bono for the period of writing and researching and drafting. And we agreed that I would do about 8 workshops to start with. Ended up being 13 or 14, but I also did some sessions at some conferences as well. And there were some sessions that people did on their own. Now we had a team of volunteers who helped along the way, people who helped with different parts of the research, who helped facilitate workshops. So we have an FFCL network of people, some of whom I can see are on the line right now, and they helped organise venues, they helped facilitate workshops, and they helped with writing up. There are all different parts of the document. For example, the checklist at the back, which is the bit that talks about what should the portfolio holder look at. Those were cleared by different regional networks linked to FFCL. So the decision was made that we would have a more fluid document, a shorter strategy, but live appendices, meaning that we could change things regularly. So although we've listed in the document a list of fraud risks, there is a document which will come out shortly which will have a list of fraud risks in more detail, and that document, which will be a companion, will be changed on a regular basis. And so we didn't want to fall into the trap that we did before about publishing a document and it coming out of date very quickly. In particular, this document is called FFCL, a strategy for the 2020s. And the idea behind that, supported by the LGA and Solace, is that it's a short document, but we will have a number of companions which will change along the way. So the first of those documents, which you'll see is in the K-Hub, is the standards document. That began when I was still working at CIPFA. In fact, CIPFA and NAFIN and the LGA consulted around 190 councils about what kind of standards they might want to see in place. Not something that would be different to the initiative that's being led by the Cabinet Office, but something which would complement that and would lead into a route into joining the government counter-fraud profession, if that's what you wanted to do. So that document is in its final draft stage and was published last week in the Knowledge Hub. There's also a document on landscape, which is again a changing document, and then we have fraud risks, and we have a number of other areas, documents which will appear over this year. Next slide, please, Laura. I'll try and speed up a little bit. So the 2020 strategy, we had many debates, and I could see quite a few of you here at the workshop, so you'll know about this. We had a lot of debates about whether there should be 1 or 2 extra pillars or any extra pillars, and the big one that really kicked in was about protect. And so much came forward about adult social care fraud and protecting the vulnerable. It came up at every single workshop, and there will be a special sort of theme running on that this year as well. So the 2 things that we added were govern, which is now the first pillar, which is about having the right governance in place and making sure that you really do have some buy-in at the top and with key stakeholders. And some of the things that we added really were about making sure that the audit committee is asking the right questions and that you can demonstrate that you're tackling fraud properly, and to give you the opportunity and help you build the case for having the right resources. And then underpinning the pillars is protect, which is about protecting public funds and protecting the vulnerable. So they're the new areas within the strategy. Now, along the way, we saw 2 that were really exemplary examples of how all of these things were encompassed, and they're at the back of the document, which is Durham County Council and Norfolk, who had really written 2 really good strategies, which we've got a shortened version of them in the document, but in the landscape document that comes out shortly, we'll have more detail on those. So next slide, please, Laura. So some of the outcomes. So a lot of things have happened during the strategy, and very much it was this engagement campaign, and we saw of 250 councils, but actually some of those councils had, were representing several groups of people. And we had a level of commitment that we didn't really have before. So the LGA have always backed it, and we do report into one of the LGA committees. But the first time Solace endorsed it completely and supported it, and you'll see that the Solace logo is on the document now, and it never was before. And very much they support that idea that it's by the sector, for the sector. And so although I went out and did, most of the workshops, it's really your thoughts that develop the document. The other thing that is quite key is that we got buy-in from the external auditors, and they've agreed that they will ensure that the audit committee looks at closely that Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 at the back of the document. So the document that says what is the chief executive looking at, all the way down to what is the portfolio holder looking at, the external auditor will have a look at that. Lots of people asked if we could make FFCL mandatory, and we can't, and we did try before. But actually having the external auditor look in some detail at those areas and get assurance from the answers is pretty good. We also had the box of promises. So if you attended a workshop, you'll know that every time we went along, I said, you're giving me information here and I'm taking away all of your issues. I'd like to see some of the activity that you can do for 2020 and beyond. And this became a list of activity. It was about 30 when we finished the research. It's more than that now. It's probably about 40, and it's live, and it's just things that are happening, which we'll report on at the conferences. And some of them are events, some of them are documents, some of them are free tools. So, for example, I've mentioned the Bazaar's free schools toolkit, and that's being redone with a group of councils, and will be appearing towards the end of the year as a free document. We also have invigorated the Champions Network, which now has chief execs, finance directors and monitoring officers in it. And when we have the conference, there is a summit planned for some of those people at the end of the day. And they have little job descriptions and will be promoting FFCL. At the conference last year, many people came forward and said that they wanted a safe discussion place where councils, operational staff could talk amongst themselves, and we could also put free resources, and it would be in a safe and secure place. And someone suggested using the Knowledge Hub, and we now do have that site available as a web page. You can only really join if you're an operational local authority person, but we do place documents in there, and as this year goes on, that will become more heavily populated. At the moment, it's myself and 2 other people who put the documents in, but if you want something to go in there, just let me know. And towards the end of this year, I will come out of that, and it will be run by one of the people who sits on the FFCL regional group. It's called the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally page. If you go into Knowledge Hub and you search for that page, then I'll let you in. You'll find it really easily. And then we have working groups. So much was the enthusiasm about the working groups is that they actually started before I managed to finish writing the strategy. So I've listed some of the areas here. It's not an exhaustive list because a couple of other things have come up, and we probably will have some other working groups. But some of them have met already, and I can see even evidence coming in from councils to build the case around some of those areas and what might happen in the future. We've also managed to get a link into the Joint Fraud Task Force, and you'll see that the forward in the document is linked to the JFT, and we were very keen to put something in place here because during the research for the strategy we picked up some patterns and trends on particular frauds happening across the country. We picked up money laundering issues, which we ended up brokering partnerships and collaboration with the National Economic Crime Centre and feeding into the JFT information. And so it made sense to try and formalise that in some way. So we're very pleased to have that, but also because it links the FFCL board to a more formalised, wider enforcement board. So the plan is later this year that the board will be widened. There's a big workshop to be done on governance internally, so the board wants to look internally. And the intention is also to formalise the FFCL network into a regional group, and that has yet to happen, although the people that are involved in it know who they are, and that's yet to happen. Obviously, with people not being around so much, it hasn't kind of happened as quickly as we thought. Next slide, please, Laura. So we still have a conference. Sadly, the conference was postponed from the 26th of March. It's now planned for the 16th of October. I really hope it's happening then. We've also got awards that night, and all the awards have been decided upon. I'm sitting on my desk in the office. and we have a summit at about 4:30 that evening for some of the champions, with some senior stakeholders from the National Economic Crime Centre and the Joint Fraud Task Force, a sort of round table. We'll also be feeding back from the working groups at the conference. So things are still happening. They're probably not happening as fast as we thought, but there's definitely quite a lot of activity happening at the moment. So hopefully we're going ahead with the conference in October. So I think that's probably it. Let me check my last slide, please. Oh yes, so the last thing about it, and we always say this, is that everything about FFCL is free. So we don't charge for anything. All of the board have a sort of agreement that we won't charge for access to any of the documents. So, you know, if you can't get access to something, then you need to let me know, and I'll obtain it for you. That's it, I think. Any questions? I think it's the next slide. Yep, that's it.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That's fantastic. Really informative session, and great to hear about the origins of the FFCL board and the strategies in the past. It's brilliant. I think we're going to take questions right at the end after I've done my section. So I'll switch over to my slides now, and then we'll carry on. But thank you very much. Great. So thanks again to Rachel for that very informative presentation. That was fantastic. And to hear about the latest update from the FFCL board and the strategy for the 2020s. So this brings me then on to the next part of our discussion this morning about the CIPFA Code of Practice on managing the risks of fraud and corruption. So before we go into detail about the strategy, I suppose that there's a question really, isn't there, about why we are looking at this now. So the previous version was put together in 2014. And with all our policies and guidance here at CIPFA, we like to periodically consider if they need an update or a refresh, given that everything that's gone on in the last 6 years. We're considering whether the Code of Practice responds well enough to the coronavirus situation. So that's having a significant impact, as we discussed in the last webinar, on fighting fraud now and going forwards. And is the Code of Practice ready for that world post COVID-19? Does it consider the questions properly about, will we need to change the way that we respond? Will we need to build resilience and risk responsiveness in a different way? How do we deal with the unknown that's coming forward? There's the perennial challenge, of course, of counter-fraud professionals in securing buy-in from a senior leadership level. Do we feel that the code does enough to understand what motivates senior management? How can we secure a bit more engagement in our agendas through a code of practice? And also considering whether the outputs of the research we've recently done should be reflected more strongly in the code of practice. So just a bit more then about the research that we commissioned. So CIPFA commissioned a piece of research from Perpetuity Research called Tackling Fraud in the Public Sector, a Local Government Response. This takes an in-depth look at fraud using the perspectives of professionals within UK local authorities. So that ranges from the counter-fraud professional to the head of service delivery, and everyone in between. The research was completed prior to the COVID-19 situation and the associated changes to our ways of working. But it did highlight at that time that 64% of senior council officers viewed fraud as a major problem. And in response to the research, we also produced a companion document here at CIPFA, just highlighting 4 of the key themes that particularly resonated with us. So those of culture and the importance of a robust counter-fraud culture, of technology, the pros and cons. It's an increasingly visible benefits that it brings, but at the same time, there are lots of challenges with cyber fraud and attacks and things like that. And there's also the question of resources and the importance of using what we have to the best of our ability and sharing resources between ourselves. And prevention, of course, came through as a really key theme from that research and something we really want to focus on going forwards. So I feel like it's important that our work going forwards does reflect on what this research showed, given that it was commissioned to look at the sector and contains the responses from the sector. So I'm sure that many of you are aware and intimate knowledge of our Code of Practice on managing the risks of fraud and corruption. But this really provides sort of a robust framework for tackling the risks of fraud and corruption within your organisation. So it was designed to speak to the leaders of public service organisations and just really set out the importance of embedding effective standards for managing fraud and corruption within your organisation. So obviously this is linked very much to good governance and effective financial stewardship, as well as strong public financial management. They're all intrinsically linked. So as you can see here with our padlock diagram, there are 5 key steps within this framework for managing the risks of fraud and corruption. So first of all, the need to acknowledge responsibility by the governing body for countering fraud and corruption, identifying the risks of fraud and corruption, developing an appropriate counter fraud and corruption strategy off the back of these risks, providing crucially the resources to implement the strategy, and then in turn taking action to ensure that this strategy doesn't just sit on the shelf as a nice document, but it's actually implemented. And truly important to stress that the code should not be viewed in isolation, but it's a key element within the good governance and strong public financial management. So just to go then delving into a little bit more detail about the code itself, the first step is obviously to acknowledge responsibility. So the governing body needs to acknowledge its responsibility for ensuring the risks associated with fraud and corruption are managed effectively across all parts of the organisation. This really sets out the importance of governing body ownership of the response to fraud and corruption risks. The steps focus on actions by the leadership team and by the governing body. And I think this really resonates quite strongly with the update to the FFCL strategy that focuses on the need to govern at that level. Emphasises really the need to have the leadership team and governing body taking their responsibility for these risks, rather than delegating it down several rungs within the organisation. After that, the second element really focuses on identifying risks, but the risks that are specific to your organisation and the kind of work you do there and the services that you deliver, rather than being a blanket risk approach for all organisations. So it's really essential to understand the specific exposure that you have, the patterns that change in terms of the fraud threats and corruption risks that you see, and really we're interested in the consequences that those may have for your organisation and your service users. So it's really about ensuring that fraud and corruption risks are mainstreamed as part of the organisation's approach to risk management, and ensuring again that these link back to the governance framework for your organisation. This area also focuses on the need to consider the harm both to your organisation and to the service users that you support. Once again, this resonates with the protection elements that we've heard about from the FFCL strategy. So once you've identified your specific risks and challenges that you face in your organisation, you need to set out a counter-fraud strategy that lays out the approach you have in your organisation to managing the risks and the responsibilities, crucially, for action. In this area, the specific activities include having a formal adoption of the strategy, setting out both important elements of the strategy itself and also the framework that sits around it. So emphasizing the importance again of integrating this with governance structures and including clear roles and responsibilities for all those stakeholders involved. The third element here focuses on the proactive and responsive approaches that need to be included in a strategy and sets out some examples. So from a proactive perspective, you would want to develop a counter-fraud culture to increase the organization's resilience to fraud. Use techniques such as data matching to validate data and spot any potential gaps that you have. You want to deter fraud attempts by really publicizing your organization's stance, countering fraud and anti-corruption, and making sure it's clear when you do take action against fraudsters, publicizing those as a deterrent. From a responsive perspective, we need to be looking in our data to see what we can find from an intelligence perspective, or what it shows us about incidences of fraud that may be in there. Want to make sure that you investigate fraud referrals, you have a clear process for triaging those and looking into them. Ensure as well that there are sanctions in place. So whether that's internal disciplinary procedures, reporting to your regulator, taking criminal action forwards, need to ensure that you do that to respond, and also that you seek redress, including trying to recover money and assets for your organisation wherever you can. And this brings us on to the fourth area, which is really key, I think, for everybody that's worked in counter-fraud and anti-corruption for any time, is really needing to have the appropriate resources in place to support the delivery of your strategy. This really resonates again with the research we conducted through Perpetuity, where we need to make sure that the resources are there and that we're making the best use of the ones that we have, working together, sharing knowledge, sharing experience. And really, this section also highlights the need to have appropriately qualified staff members with the right mandate within your organisation, people who can adhere to the correct professional standards and who are qualified to undertake their tasks. There's always a really key challenge here about making a case for investment in counter-fraud. We'd all agree that prevention is better than cure, and indeed that's what came out with the research we conducted and is highlighted in our companion document. But making a case for investment in prevention can be hard, as was also highlighted in the research. So we need to work together to find a way to make the case for investment. The final step in the framework is around having the right policies and procedures in place to support your counter-fraud and anti-corruption strategy, and really to take action to prevent, detect and investigate fraud. So really here it's important that we integrate a response to fraud within the broader operations and governance of your organisation. So as a minimum, you'd hope this framework would include not only your counter-fraud policy, but whistleblowing policies, anti-bribery policies, gifts and hospitality policies and registers, codes of conduct and ethical policies, cybersecurity, information security. There are many elements that build together to support our counter-fraud agenda and strategy. And it brings us again also full circle to the importance of the role of the governing body. It's key to ensure that the governing body is informed annually, at least annually, if not more often, about the performance against the strategy. And the strategy that you have is really a tool to assess performance of your function. Have you delivered on what you set out in the strategy? And these conclusions should really be featuring in the annual governance report. So the Code of Practice doesn't exist in isolation. It has a number of supporting documents and obviously links in to other work streams. So the code is underpinned by a set of guidance notes that explain the importance of each of the steps that we've discussed and how they can be applied in practice. The notes have tips in there on relating the code to different governance frameworks in different kinds of public service organisations. They can be particularly useful if you're trying to improve the effectiveness of your counter-fraud arrangements. There's also a tool, a self-assessment tool that sits behind this that allows you to really evaluate your performance against the code, the counter-fraud code of practice we've been discussing. So it includes again examples of good practice to inform your assessment, gives you a place to record your comments and the evidence that you have to support each of the steps that you've taken. And you can really track your progress year on year and take it to your audit committee and use it to inform your annual governance statement for your organisation. So it really, sort of helps you to identify strengths and weaknesses and next steps that you need to take to improve your situation. As I've been saying quite a lot through this session, it's really important to see the Code of Practice, in context with other documents. So other documents and other functions. So for example, the role of the audit committee. Audit committees have a really important role to play in the counter-fraud agenda. They can make a contribution to the fight against fraud by helping to ensure that public bodies' arrangements are really fit for purpose and that fraud risks are recognised and acted on really from the top level down. Internal audit should have sufficient knowledge of fraud and corruption risks, and they have a key role to play in providing assurance on counter-fraud, reviewing the implementation of your counter-fraud strategy, ensuring that there's assurance on the adequacy of the arrangements that you have in place. Internal audit play a key role as well, as do all of us in our organisation, of building a culture that's resilient to fraud and corruption. And as we've been saying all the way through, there's an intrinsic link to good governance of having a strong response to fraud and corruption in place within your organisation too. So how can we build on this strong framework that we've already got in place? Are there any gaps? Are there any things that we should be considering more of? Although the Code of Practice is very clearly aimed at senior leaders already, how can we reinforce this role in making sure that they are setting the right tone from the top and building a culture of resilience to risks of fraud and corruption? Do we need to do something else? Do we need a one-pager that targets these leaders? How do we develop this and really make sure it resonates with them and the challenges that they're facing? And protection has been highlighted as a key activity. So protecting funds, protecting our service users, protecting our organisation from the risks of fraud and corruption. Should we make this more explicit in a future version of the code? Is that a gap that needs to be addressed? The perpetuity research highlighted the 4 key themes, of course, of culture, technology, resources, and prevention. Are these evidenced sufficiently in the code as it stands? Is prevention there strongly enough as being a key way to prevent losses leaving the organisation as a result of fraud and corrupt activities? In our current constantly changing world, adapting to emergencies such as COVID-19, how do we ensure that the counter-fraud agenda isn't forgotten? How do we continue to build that resilience and make it adaptable to the risks that we see? Not only things like the emergency response we have at the moment, but also the increased use of technology. We want to make sure we avoid the traps and pitfalls it creates, but also make sure we can reap the benefits from a counter-fraud and anti-corruption perspective. We need to make sure that there's appropriate investment in resources to meet the challenges being faced, and that these are adaptable to the circumstances that we face going forwards. So we're really keen to involve you in the discussion around the Code of Practice and how it could be strengthened and built upon as it currently is. So if you've got any comments or you'd like to be part of that conversation, then do get in touch with me at the details below. Be very good to hear your comments and what you think's working well and what could be built upon. So we'll move now then to taking some questions. So as I said earlier, if you do have a question for Rachael or me, please do put them in the chat and we'll address them now. So thank you very much for listening. Just unmute Rachael. Great. So the first question I can see here, which possibly Rachael addressed already, but I'll just ask again. What's the K-Hub group called?
Yeah, it's called Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally. I think the person that's asked has actually joined, sent me an invitation.
Oh, brilliant.
A request
That's good.
to join already.
In real time.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I've actually got a question for you, Rachael. I wondered, what do you think is the most challenging thing you've faced in putting the strategy together and updating it this time around?
Well, I could have done more workshops because we kept getting in more requests to do more things, and actually probably if I'd had another couple more sessions, we could have done some deep dives into some other areas. As it is, we've set those up as working groups now, so I think that's probably worked just as well, I guess. What I would say is that we've had 4 working groups so far since we've been in lockdown. We've been having the working groups, and they're all really well attended, and everyone's coming up with ideas and keeping in touch and talking about current issues, which is really good to see.
Excellent. Yes, it's kind of provided an opportunity, hasn't it, in some ways for people to keep more in touch. I find the fact that we're all remotely based. Yeah. Leslie, thanks for your question. Are there any timescales for the Code of Practice review? So at this stage, we're just doing an early scoping exercise to find out if there's appetite for a review and what people might like to see in there. So we haven't got a timescale for that as yet. But if you do have any thoughts, or if you love it the way it is and you absolutely don't want to change, then do get in touch as well. So I think that's what we would say. Kate O'Brien has asked Rachael if how can they join the working groups, or is it too late to do that?
Not at all. Just drop me an email at rachel.tiffin@cifas.org.uk, and I'll let you know what the working groups are, and you can say which ones you want to join.
Great, fantastic. And we will circulate the slides later, so you'll have all the address details and everything. So you'll be able to pick up on that, Kate, with Rachel if you want to. Lovely. Great. I think that's all the questions we've had actually this morning, Rachel.
I'm getting lots of requests to join
Oh,
the
that's
Knowledge Hub,
fantastic.
which
That's good.
is really good.
Yeah, lovely. That's great. And are people able to share their own resources on the Knowledge Hub? Is that the idea, that they can then share?
Yeah, at the moment, if they send them to the Knowledge Hub, I'll pick them up and I'll post them there. And hopefully in a few months, it won't be me that's doing that, but somebody else.
Great. That's good to know. Oh, another question's come in from David here. Are there any arrangements for linking in with the NHS counter-fraud activities? With the adult social care agenda, it would be useful to ensure. So I think certainly from our perspective at CIPFA, the NHS were involved with the kind of first draft of the Code of Practice. So if we go on to review it, we wouldn't expect to involve them and get their perspective as well. I don't know if you had something to say there, Rachel, too.
Sorry, I can't actually see the question.
Oh, sorry. It says, are there any arrangements for linking in with the local NHS counter-fraud activities? With the adult social care
Yes, yeah.
agenda, it would be useful to ensure this. So I think from our side, we'd involve them certainly in the Code of Practice review if we end up taking that forwards. But I don't know if you had anything to.
Oh, yeah. So there is a working group on adult social care fraud, and so with all the working groups, they've sort of begun as local authority only, so that the issue can be scoped, and then the group can decide who else to involve. But somebody has already suggested involving the NHS in that group, so there is a working group already. If you wanted to join that group, you'd be very welcome. We will have some NHS input into that at some point.
Brilliant. That's very good. Another question here from Mike. What are your views on NFI, as most authorities have some alternate real-time arrangements in place? So I suppose from my perspective, I think both arrangements have a role to play. You know, the NFI is a national service. They have certain powers and legislation behind them that others can't have, providing you with real-time services. So I think probably both tools have their benefits, really. Do you have any comments on that, Rachel?
No, I agree with you. It's a national exercise, and it does have a part to play. And obviously, people can engage in things outside of that. And actually, there is a working group on data that will include looking at all sorts of things that are available, NFI being one of them.
And I really feel actually that the whole coronavirus pandemic has really spurred lots of organizations on to examine their data and their digital setup. So in that way, it's been a real catalyst, actually. So I would expect there to be quite a lot of potential for change going forwards in a good way, you know, in terms of all of those things. Really help people to integrate and share more than they were previously. So there's a question for Rachel. How much impact will COVID-19 have on the FFCL 2020? And what's the risk that it will be out of date when it's published?
Okay, so it was published on the 26th of March, and the idea is that it's a very short document, and that it will have a series of live companions, so it won't become out of date. If you want a copy of the strategy, if you drop me an email, I'll point you to the webpage or to the K-Hub.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's very helpful. And is there a reason why the strategy is just for England and doesn't extend to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland?
No, in fact, Scotland and Northern Ireland before had said that they weren't that engaged with the previous strategy, which was the 2016 strategy. However, there might be something that happens with Wales on this current document that's probably not finalised enough to discuss today.
Excellent. And presumably there are lessons for everyone in the strategy. many of those things we would all want to be taking forward
Yeah,
anyway. I
yeah.
think it's important to stress that too.
Yeah, and we have been at pains to, I mean, obviously the Code of Practice came out in 2014,
Yes, yeah.
and myself and Diana Melville and Alan Bryce
Hmm.
were the people that put that together. But we had also worked on the FFCL strategy. So the
Yes.
idea is that all of these things link together in some way, so you don't have 27 different checklists, and that by doing one of these things, you meet a lot of other criteria.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that's we're keen to make sure that continues to be the case, certainly. Any more questions just finally before we wrap up? Oops. So as part of the NFI, we are working hard to develop post assurance in relation to COVID as well as real-time checks that have been made available already. If you do have queries, please contact us. Oh, that's good. Thank you very much. To Kiri Wisman, hope I've said your name correctly. Lovely. Thank you. That's very helpful. Great. Okay, well, thank you everyone very much for tuning in this morning when we're all so busy. And thanks again to Rachael, especially for giving up her time to tell us more about the strategy. That was fantastic. As I said before, we will upload a recording of this session onto our website so you can go there and listen again, download the slides and review and share with your colleagues. So thank you very much for listening.